In the last video, I gave an introduction of Revelation chapters 2 and 3, Jesus' messages to the seven churches. In this video, we want to begin our study of Jesus' message to the first church in Revelation 2, verses 1 through 7, the church in Ephesus. Now, out of all of the churches in Revelation in these seven cities, we are by far the most familiar with the church in the city of Ephesus. After all, Luke in the book of Acts, chapter 19, details for us Paul's ministry in the city of Ephesus. And then, of course, we also have Paul's letter, Ephesians, his letter to the church in Ephesus. So we know a lot about the church in Ephesus. And as we study Jesus' message to the church in Ephesus here in Revelation, he identifies himself in verse 1, saying, "The words of him who holds the seven stars in his right hand, who walks among the seven golden lampstands." Jesus is using imagery from chapter 1, from John's vision of Jesus, to describe himself. And in particular, I love that Jesus describes himself as the one who walks among the seven golden lampstands. The seven golden lampstands are, of course, the seven churches. And so what Jesus is saying here is, I am the one who is walking in your midst, in the midst of the local church. For me as a pastor, it's very comforting to know that Jesus is here. He is walking in my midst. And he's also walking among your church as well. And therefore, Jesus says in verse 2, I know your works. If Jesus is walking among us, he sees us, he knows our works. And we said that the structure of each one of these seven messages is that Jesus begins with the good. He praises the church for the good things, but he also corrects them for the bad things. And so in particular, Jesus praises the church in Ephesus for your toil and your patient endurance, it says. In particular, Jesus says, you have tested those who say that they are apostles and are not, and have found them to be false. In those days, there were a lot of traveling ministers and teachers, and the Ephesians would test the messages of these itinerant ministers, and if they found them to be false, to be preaching error, then they would not tolerate them. And I think this is a good reminder for you and for me. Nowadays, with TV and radio, and especially with the internet, we have access to a world of teaching. And yet John says to test the spirits, whether they be of God. We need to test the teachings of various pastors and leaders, and if they are not, if they don't line up with the truth of God's word, we need to go elsewhere. Second, Jesus says, I know that you are enduring patiently. By this time, the church in Ephesus, having been planted between 52 and 55 AD, was about 40 years old. And so Jesus is praising this church for their endurance. You haven't given up, but you've remained faithful to me. And then in verse 4, we come to the correction. Jesus says, I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love that you had at first. Literally, he says, you have left your first love. Of course, this leads to the question, what is your first love? What does Jesus mean by you've left your first love? And the fact of the matter is, we don't really know exactly what Jesus is referring to here. But what is the greatest commandment? What did Jesus teach us are the two greatest commandments of the law? He says, number one, what? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And the second is like it, Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. So when Jesus says here, I have this against you, that you've left your first love, he's probably either referring to the Ephesians' love towards God or the Ephesians' love towards others. Or perhaps he's referring to some kind of combination of both. And I think this is a good word for you and for me to examine our hearts before the Lord. How is your love for God? Has your love for God grown cold? How about your love for others? Showing God's love towards others. Has your love towards others grown cold? And Jesus would have us to fan the flame of the love, His love in our hearts, both towards Him and towards others. It's easy in our Christian life to go through the motions, to live on cruise control, to just settle into some kind of rut, and to allow our love towards God to grow cold. It's easy as Christians, as we grow in our knowledge of the truth, as we have experiences serving in ministry, some are good and some are not so good, to allow our love towards others to grow cold. And the message of the Lord would be to test, to check your heart, examine your heart, and allow the Lord to fan the flame of your love towards God and your love towards others once again, that you would burn with the love of God in this world. Well, that's all we have time for in this video. We'll have to conclude our study of Jesus' message to the church in Ephesus next time. I'd encourage you to subscribe to this channel. Thank you for watching.